What if death wasn't personal? What if it was just random? And what if that randomness wasn't terrifying, but freaking hilarious? Oz Perkins' latest film, The Monkey, takes fatalism, trauma, and horror, throws them in a blender, and somehow the result is comedy. Let's break it down. The movie doesn't shy away from fatalism. It even spells it out for us. Several times, characters react to death with the phrase, "That sucks," or "Everybody dies, and that's life." It's played for laughs, but it reinforces the idea that death is just a random coin toss, much like Anton Chigurh's philosophy in No Country for Old Men. In fact, the movie explicitly states that the deaths caused by the monkey are as random as a coin toss, further cementing the theme of fatalism that runs throughout the film. But fatalism isn't just a narrative device in this film. It's a deeply philosophical concept that has shaped human thinking for centuries. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that life is governed by a blind, indifferent will, meaning that free will is an illusion, and we are simply carried along by fate. Now, it's important to note that Schopenhauer rejected the idea of passive fatalism. Instead, he argued from a determinist lens. However, for all intents and purposes, his belief that free will is an illusion and that life is governed by blind, impersonal forces aligns perfectly with the monkey's premise. These characters aren't choosing their fates. They're simply playing out roles determined by forces beyond their control. In Schopenhauer's view, life is like a pro wrestling match. The outcomes are predetermined, but the participants still go through the motions, acting as if they have control. Until the end of the film, the monkey leans into a Schopenhauer fatalism, where the characters feel utterly powerless against an uncaring mechanical force, rather than taking control of their fate. From a sociological perspective, fatalism plays a key role in existential despair, the belief that one's circumstances are controlled by external forces beyond their influence. And this sense of sociological fatalism is further reinforced by a key concept in psychology, learned helplessness. Pioneered by psychologist Martin Seligman, learned helplessness describes that deeply ingrained feeling of powerlessness, the belief that your actions simply do not matter, that you have no control over what happens to you. In his 1967 experiment, Seligman and his team placed dogs in a controlled environment where they were exposed to mild but unavoidable electric shocks. Over time, the dogs stopped even trying to escape, even when they were given the chance to avoid the shocks. Their past experiences had taught them that resistance was futile. In essence, the dogs learned to be helpless. Modern psychology has since extrapolated Seligman's original findings to human behavior, concluding that humans too learn to be helpless. Think about the characters in The Monkey. They try to destroy it, hide it, escape it, but the monkey always returns, and death always follows. This relentless, inescapable nature of the curse perfectly embodies learned helplessness, solidifying the film's bleakly fatalistic worldview, where individual actions feel utterly meaningless against the tide of fate. But here's the thing, everyone's going to be talking about that. The randomness of fate, the absence of free will, and how you can't escape death. Sure, that's interesting, but we've seen it in so many films before, and it's so on the nose in this film, there's almost nothing left to analyze. But you know what is interesting? Is how the monkey uses humor to make the horror palatable. So why do we laugh when things get too violent? Why, none other than our old pal Sigmund Freud argued in Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious that humor acts as a psychological release valve, allowing us to express repressed thoughts and emotions in a socially acceptable way. This is particularly evident in dark comedy and gallows humor, where people find laughter as a way to process extreme fear, death, and existential dread. Humor as a defense mechanism. Freud argued that humor can be a way of coping with distress or anxiety. It allows individuals to take an observer's perspective on their fears rather than being overwhelmed by them. In horror films, grotesque deaths played for laughs create emotional distance from fear by making it absurd. This theory ties into the monkey's mix of horror and comedy. If the film turns fatal accidents into punchlines, it's using humor to disarm fear, letting the audience process mortality and randomness of death in a way that feels less psychologically threatening. Interestingly, while many of Freud's theories have been widely critiqued or abandoned, his theories on humor have held up much better, as contemporary psychology still acknowledges humor as a tool for emotional regulation and coping with distress. But there's more to it than just Freud's psychological theories. Incongruity Theory, a more modern explanation, suggests that humor arises when there's a mismatch between our expectations and reality. The monkey leans into this. Deaths are so ridiculously exaggerated that they stop being scary and start being Looney Tunes level of funny. The film also taps into benign violation theory, which argues that we laugh when something violates social or moral norms, but only if we perceive it as ultimately harmless or absurd. The over-the-top deaths in The Monkey, such as the school bus full of cheerleaders who all get beheaded by oncoming traffic, work because they push the boundaries of horror but remain exaggerated enough that the audience can't help but find it humorous. The film presents death in two competing ways. First, there's the terrifying reality that death can come randomly and meaninglessly, represented by the monkey's arbitrary killing spree. But then, the film immediately undercuts this terror with absurdist humor. When characters respond to horrific deaths with casual sayings like, "Everybody's dies, that sucks," they're essentially modeling a cultural response to death that makes it manageable. Think about the scene where a gorgeous woman suddenly explodes diving into the motel swimming pool. In pure horror terms, this should be traumatic, but the film's darkly comedic treatment makes it incongruent and a violation of social norms. A death that should evoke horror instead elicits laughter, much like how real people use humor to deal with trauma. But while humor makes it easy for us to watch, the real horror isn't the monkey. It's what the monkey does to the people who survive it. Let's talk about Bill. Bill isn't just paranoid, he's deeply traumatized. His hypervigilance, setting up traps, obsessing over the monkey, fixating on revenge, this is classic trauma response behavior. As we've explored on this channel before, early childhood experiences profoundly shape how we process trauma and form relationships throughout life. While the monkey doesn't explicitly detail Bill's early childhood, his intense need for control, his fixation on revenge, and his inability to form healthy relationships all could be interpreted as stemming from insecure attachment patterns. For a deeper dive into the different attachment styles, check out our previous episode on the penguin's attachment with Francis, linked in the description below. But Bill's trauma goes deeper than attachment theory. While his relationship patterns reflect insecure attachment, it's the dramatic shift in his power dynamics that truly shapes his destructive behavior. As a child, Bill was the bully. He had power over his brother Hal. But the moment his mother died, his entire power dynamic flipped. The aggressor became the victim. This kind of trauma can create an obsessive need to reclaim control. But instead of healing, Bill fixates not just on revenge, but on forcing someone else to experience what he went through. Freud called this repetition compulsion, when someone unconsciously recreates past trauma, hoping to master it. That is, to gain control over the traumatic experience in retrospect by recreating aspects of it. But modern PTSD research offers another explanation: trauma reenactment syndrome. Psychologists have found that some trauma survivors compulsively seek out situations that mirror their original trauma. Why? Because their brain is stuck in survival mode, replaying the past in an attempt to finally gain control over it. Studies on childhood trauma survivors have shown that many unintentionally recreate their past in relationships, careers, or even dangerous situations. The brain struggles to process unresolved trauma, leading to self-destructive cycles, just like Bill's revenge obsession. Bill isn't just trying to kill Hal, he's trying to make Hal's son experience the same horror he did. He's forcing Petey into his past trauma, as if that will somehow bring him closure. But there's another layer here. This isn't just Bill's trauma anymore. He's now passing it down to Petey. In the film, we see Bill forcing Hal into a situation where Petey will be the one to turn the monkey's key. Because, as Bill explains in the film, the person who turns the key doesn't die. Bill wants Petey to turn the key with the misguided hope that the monkey will kill his dad, just like the monkey killed Bill's mom when Hal turned the key. He somehow thinks this is going to bring him closure. It won't, but he thinks it will in the movie. This is called transgenerational trauma. Instead of breaking the cycle, Bill is attempting to ensure that it continues. The Monkey isn't just about fate. It's about how survivors choose to deal with trauma. You can laugh it off, you can let it consume you, or, if you're lucky, you could be the one to stop the cycle. As far as the ending goes, what do you guys think? Do you think the Pale Horseman nodding to Hal and Petey, and then Hal driving through the intersection, unscathed, symbolizes that Hal has finally broken the cycle? Or do you think it was just another case of randomness, which could be argued was symbolized by the cheerleaders on the school bus being beheaded? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below.